mourning a man whose crime, in the words of his supporters, was being born black. More than 500 guests attended the funeral in Houston, Texas for George Floyd, whose death under the knee of a white policeman sparked global protests calling for racial justice.
God bless you, Florida.
Speakers at the ceremony made impassioned pleas for change.
Why must this system be corrupt and broken? Laws were already put in place for the African American system to fail. And these laws need to be changed. No more hate crimes, please. Someone said, make America great again. But when has America ever been great?
In a fierce eulogy, civil rights activist Reverend Al Sharpton accused President Donald Trump of caring more about trying to stop protests than ending police brutality.
And until we know the price for black life is the same as the price for white life, we're going to keep coming back to these situations over and over again. Either the law will work or it won't work.
Trump's opponent in the presidential election, Democrat Joe Biden, also delivered a video message to the funeral.
Now is the time for racial justice. That's the answer we must give to our children when they ask why. Because when there is justice for George Floyd, we will truly be on our way to racial justice in America. And then, as you said, Gianna, your daddy will have changed the world.
While solemn, the funeral was also a rousing tribute to the life of Floyd. Many supporters lined the streets as his body was taken to its final resting place. A last farewell to Floyd. His death galvanized a movement. Now, his supporters say they won't rest until there is real change in the world, so that deaths like his won't happen again.
DW's Oliver Sallet is in Houston. Oliver, you were at the Fountain of Praise Church where George Floyd's funeral took place yesterday. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it was a very sad and emotional day. The procession, the ceremony in the church lasted for 4 hours. You got a little bit of an idea through the report that we've just seen. His family members delivering highly emotional speeches, moved to tears, of course. But then there was also this cheerful aspect to the ceremony. The family wanted to celebrate the life of George Floyd, and that was done in the tradition of the Afro-American church. So with lots of gospel music, lots of music played in general, of course. And in addition to that, there was a political dimension, and that was with Congress people who came from Washington delivering speeches, civil rights activists. And one of the speakers was the Democrat Al Green, and I had the opportunity, Terry, to speak to him earlier. Let's listen in what he had to say.
We need reconciliation in this country. In Germany, we've had reconciliation to a great extent. You don't see signs recognizing Hitler. You don't see statues. In this country, we still have Confederate statues up. Well, if we have a reconciliation department in the cabinet of the United States of America with a Secretary of Reconciliation who reports directly to the president, whose job it is to eliminate racism and invidious discrimination, who reports to the Congress on a semi-annual basis and reports how well he's doing his job, what progress are we making? This is what we are going to need for the long run so that we can take care of the problems not only today, but into the distant future.
Oliver, George Floyd's death has sparked worldwide protests against police brutality and racism. How confident are people you've been talking to there that his death will be a catalyst for real change?
People are very hopeful, and you could really see that on Monday when the public viewing here took place. Thousands came to bid farewell. You could buy his T-shirts, his posters. A mural was painted here in his old neighborhood where hundreds gathered on the day of his funeral. So he became an icon for this movement, and that's what many people are so proud of, that someone who was largely unknown to the public became the face of a worldwide movement, sparking protests worldwide. And people people really do believe that his death was not in vain, and that it could eventually bring change and improvement, of course, and send out a strong signal against racism in the United States, but also around the world.
Oliver, thank you so much. That was DW's Oliver Salet in Houston, Texas. The United States saw more protests following the funeral of George Floyd. Protesters gathered in Minneapolis, where he was killed, and in New York, lawmakers responded to calls for police reforms, voting to repeal a law that shields police disciplinary records from the public. Police have protested the move, but for relatives of victims of police brutality, it was a long-awaited victory.
While they hailed from different places, they descended on New York City with a common demand. They want the state's police department defunded. United by a shared story, families and supporters of victims of police brutality gathered to have their voices heard.
When he cried out, "Mommy, Mommy," I did the same thing. My mother's been gone. When my son was killed, I cried out, "Mommy, Mommy," helped him.
In an emotional day for many, the march came as George Floyd was laid to rest in his hometown of Houston, Texas.
Come on, y'all. Another black family mourning. What's this country got to say?
Floyd's death while in police custody last month energised a global movement against racism and police brutality, with mounting calls for police forces across the country to be dismantled.
Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe.
In a step towards transparency, New York lawmakers repealed decades-old legislation that kept police officers' disciplinary records secret. The measure is aimed at restoring trust in the community. New York police officers have rallied against the move.
I am not Derek Chauvin. They are not him. He killed someone. We didn't. Everybody's trying to shame us. The legislators, the press, everybody's trying to shame us into being embarrassed about our profession.
Calls for respecting police officers have been drowned out by louder, more urgent demands for change.
Well, George Floyd's death came as no surprise to Spike Lee. The director of films like Malcolm X and Do the Right Thing has made a short film himself, which makes connections between George Floyd's death and what the filmmaker sees as institutionalized violence and racism in America's police forces. The Oscar winner told DW why this time he's hopeful of change.
Spike Lee's response to the death of George Floyd was to make this film, editing footage of Floyd's killing with the chokehold death of Eric Garner in 2014, and with scenes from his own 1989 film, Do the Right Thing.
Do the Right Thing was based upon the real-life chokehold murder of a graffiti artist, Michael Stewart. And then I began thinking about all those other black people being killed.
The simple and brutal message is this has happened before. If nothing changes, this will happen again. But Lee does see a difference this time in the broad group of Americans whose response to George Floyd's death was to take to the streets.
Not just black and brown Americans, you know, the white Americans, my white sisters and brothers are taking to the streets and joining us arm in arm and saying this has to stop. And there's a national cry for these police departments across America. We got to do something with them. You know, they gotta be reformed. Change has to happen. How policing is done in the United States of America.
Black GI.
For decades, Spike Lee has been making movies about U.S. racism and the forgotten history of African Americans. Amid the shoot-'em-up action of his new film, The Five Bloods, about black Vietnam vets, Lee slips in social and political commentary. About the current resident of the White House, Lee doesn't mince words. His nickname for President Donald Trump says it all.
Agent Orange is going to go down as the worst president in the history of the United States of America.
Yes.
And it's funny now to see his allies, these generals and politicians, are slowly starting to move away from him because they could read the writing on the wall and they don't want to go down in history attached to this guy written down in history on the wrong side of history with a capital W.
For the first time in decades, one of America's loudest critics sees hope for real change.
The hope I see is the millions of Americans who've taken to the streets and saying enough is enough. I see hope. And I'll even feel more hopeful on November 4th. That's the day after the presidential election.